The final period of the Middle Ages, in our final video on the Middle Ages, was the late Middle Ages. Remember, it began with the early Middle Ages, moves on to the high Middle Ages, and then transitions to the late Middle Ages. In 1500, the Renaissance begins, and that ends the Middle Ages of European history. So, the late Middle Ages was a time of human misery and disaster. The population of Europe suffered greatly from both the Hundred Years' War between France and England and the Black Death that came from China, with both occurring during the same time period. Start with the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War was a consequence of the growth of medieval France and England. When William the Conqueror became King of England, he tied the nobility of France to the nobility of England. Remember, William had come from Normandy, France. As a result, tensions mounted over the years regarding who had the right to rule either country. The English and French had also become competitors in many economic pursuits, in particular the wool trade, and control of Flemish towns and vital to the wool trade. Trouble began when the English claimed Aquitaine, a region in southern France. In 1329, Edward III of England paid homage, a fee, for Aquitaine to the King of France. When Philip VI took over Aquitaine in 1337, however, Edward responded by invading France. So the King of France invades Aquitaine, so the King of England goes on into France, thus beginning a series of intermittent wars that would last for 116 years. See, the Hundred Years' War was longer than 100 years. The Hundred Years' War started with several English victories. Many historians divide the Hundred Years' War into four phases. Two phases featured English success, each followed by the French rallying to push the English out of their lands. The war ended in 1453 when the French finally expelled the English from mainland Europe, back to their island in England. The English use of skilled archers during the war proved to be influential to technology of the time. They used a longbow, something no one else had. It was highly effective when used against knights, whose slow, bulky armor couldn't provide sufficient defense in the face of a multiple arrow attack. So the arrow technology was huge in this war. Joan of Arc. One of the French heroines of the Hundred Years' War was Joan of Arc, Joan d'Arc, the daughter of peasants. She claimed that she heard the voice that told her to expel the English from France. She heard a voice from God, told her to get rid of the English. She managed to persuade the King of France that she should be allowed to fight alongside the men in the war due to her passion and faith. And at this point in the war, the French king was desperate. They had just lost a major battle. It looked bad. You have nothing to lose. Go ahead, Joan. Go ahead and fight for us. She can't make it worse. She became a successful soldier, though, whose will and strength inspired the French to several victories. She really turned the war around for France. She was eventually captured, though, by the English and shipped to England to face trial for heresy. Found guilty, she was burned at the stake. So the English got rid of her. But she is such an inspiring symbol for the French. And remember, the French do end up winning the war. She played a large part in that. She turned it around. Let's talk about the other disaster of the late Middle Ages, the plague. During the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance time, the bubonic plague, commonly referred to as the Black Death, ravaged the population of Europe. It was transmitted to humans by fleas that had bitten infected rats. The disease caused very painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes. The name Black Death came from the dried blood which would often form under the skin and cause black spots. So, how did this thing spread? Well, the plague started in China and killed millions of people in mainland Asia. Due to its highly communicable nature, it spread very quickly. It goes person to person fast. It first reached Europe and Sicily in 1347 when a merchant ship returning from China landed carrying rats and infected fleas. You'll see that the plague initially starts always in port cities where the ships bring it, and then spreads inland from there. By 1348, the plague had ravaged southern Europe. By 1350, it had hit Central Europe and the British Isles. The plague spread for several reasons, including the outbreak of war. Remember, the Hundred Years' War was fought while the plague infected Europe, and the fact that many infected people often brought the disease to new locations by trying to escape the horrors of the disease. So if your town's sick, you want to leave that town, well, you just kind of brought it with you to wherever you went. At the time, the field of medicine did not understand what caused the Black Death or how to cure it. Doctors wore strange costumes and used folk cures to deal with the disease. Among the more absurd remedies was bathing in human urine, wearing excrement, poop, rub that all over, placing dead animals in homes, wearing leeches, drinking molten gold and powdered emeralds, burning incense to get rid of the smell of the dead. Not surprisingly, these cures did little to address the real problems of the plague, and many even made the disease worse. Rubbing excrement on yourself, bathing in urine, no, that's gonna make things worse. The Europeans, they weren't bathing; they were getting dirtier. We know today washing your hands is the best way to prevent illness. They were doing the opposite. They were getting dirty. Most obvious effect of the plague was the number of people killed, an estimated 25 to 30 million Europeans, or roughly a third of the entire population of the continent. The plague also shook many people's faith in religion. Though many religious leaders blamed the plague on sin, piety and prayer offered no protection against the disease. And members of the clergy were as likely to become afflicted as anyone else. In the face of all this, the numbers of those willing to devote their life to the church dramatically declined. The population decrease caused by the plague led to an economic downturn. Both the number of available laborers and consumers declined sharply. Merchants and tradespeople had fewer people to whom they could sell their wares. Products therefore accumulated, and the merchants and those who dealt with them, bankers, suppliers, shippers, they all lost revenue. In addition, peasants often fled their land in an attempt to escape the disease. The plague also influenced many of the artists of the time. Works from this period often had very dark themes and tones. Let's talk about Gothic architecture. The Middle Ages saw a boom in building of cathedrals and churches in Europe. By the 11th century, a clear but short lived style of architecture emerged called Romanesque because it featured Roman like style inspired by Italian basilicas. This style produced an interior that was shaped like a Latin cross. From the exterior, the Romanesque church looked massive with heavy horizontal lines. The central area of the church, called the nave, was covered with a barrel vault, supported by pillars and thick walls. There were few windows, thus the interior was gloomy, poorly lit. A dramatic new style, known as Gothic, was introduced in the early 12th century. The architects of this style developed the ribbed vault, which worked like an umbrella to spread the weight of the roof from columns to the walls. To prevent the walls from collapsing outwards, a structure called a flying buttress braced them from the outside. When combined with pointed arches, this meant a cathedral could have larger interior spaces and larger windows, allowing the building to be filled with light. No more gloomy churches. Many of these cathedrals use stained glass to fill their windows, and the creation of stained glass evolved into a distinct art form. Prior to the invention of the printing press, all documents were manuscriptus, meaning written by hand. This Latin phrase is also the source of the English word manuscript. Most of the time, copied manuscripts were Bibles or other religious works, such as prayer books. The manuscripts were usually produced by monks who went about the laborious task of hand copying books in special rooms called scriptura, writing room. The monks would also illustrate the manuscripts, a process known as illumination. Monks would illuminate manuscripts both to glorify sacred texts and to help the illiterate understand what the book was discussing. Pictures to help you understand what's going on. After 1200, books became more common, and professional scribes and illustrators began producing works. Often, they were commissioned by the wealthy. The illumination of manuscripts became an art form, as well as illustrations appropriate to the story, verse, or prayer. Capital letters at the beginning of each page were often decorated in bright colors and gold leaf. They would literally shine. There's gold in the paper. The legacy of the medieval era. Well, the medieval era is considered a transitional period between a classical ancient world of the Romans and the modern world that the Renaissance brought. Immediately after the fall of Rome, Europe disintegrated into a number of small kingdoms and states. The Dark Ages, our Middle Ages. Um, Throughout this period, new kingdoms gradually evolved into states. That's how we got England and France and Spain, for example. Those are some of the legacies of this period. We get our modern states from the medieval times. The Catholic Church expands its influence throughout Western Europe, with little to challenge its dominance, although issues such as the Inquisition and the Crusades may have diminished its prestige. Despite the popular view of medieval Europe as the Dark Ages, many modern institutions originated during this time, including universities, the parliamentary form of government, and banks. What historians often refer to as modern Europe was beginning to take shape by the end of the 15th century, the late Middle Ages. The emergence of modern Europe would be shaped by other factors as well. Directly after the Middle Ages comes the Renaissance, the Reformation, global exploration. And that is our final video on the Middle Ages.